Welcome to the PowerApps and Microsoft Flow with Dynamics 365 course. In this course, we're going to be looking at how you can use PowerApps to build task-based applications that work with Dynamics 365 data and other data in your enterprise. We'll also be using Microsoft Flow. Microsoft Flow is good for automating tasks across different applications, including things that are started within the Power App. So we'll see how you can use those two together. And in both cases, we'll be talking with Dynamics 365 and leveraging some of the data and services that you're used to working with. Since we'll be spending some time together, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is David Yak. I will be your trainer, or as I like to think about it, your tour guide as we go through this course. I'm with Colorado Technology Consultants, a consulting firm located in Colorado Springs, Colorado, but we service customers worldwide. My focus is solution architecture, including all the things associated with Dynamics 365, including Azure and Office 365. Before we jump into the course content, I wanted to take a minute to give you an overview of what we plan to cover in the course and how you might go about using the content that we provide you. The course is broken down into 6 modules. All of the modules except Module 6 have a practice exercise that you can do along with listening to the content. The practice exercises are designed so that you can practice what we've talked about in each of the modules and better understand by actually doing the work. Module 1 is an overview. We actually overview PowerApps, Microsoft Flow, as well as the Common Data Service at a very high level. Module 1 is good for anybody that not only wants to build applications, but just wants to understand the technology. Those of you that want to actually build an application or flows with Microsoft Flow should continue on to the remaining modules and dig in deeper. In Module 2, we continue our journey with PowerApps, learning how to connect to Dynamics 365. So using the connectors, we learn how to access data, how to bring that back, show it in a gallery or a list, as well as to use forms for detail editing and other patterns for working with the data. In Module 3, we continue building on what you learned in Module 1 and 2. You've now built an application, you've connected to Dynamics 365, you've gotten some data back. Now you're starting to think about what you're going to actually do in the application. So what we want to do in Module 3 is talk about some of the common tasks that you might encounter, everything from things that are Power App specific, such as setting themes, to things that are more Dynamics 365 centric, like opening the record in Dynamics 365 from the Power App application. In Module 4, as we switch gears a little bit, we start talking about Microsoft Flow. We'll start this module by first learning about some of the fundamentals of Flow, but then we'll also end the module with talking about how you can connect a PowerApps to start the flow and transfer data from the PowerApps application to the flow that runs in the background, talking to different systems using the connectors. So really building also on what we learned in Module 2, where we talked about connecting to Dynamics 365, we also learn about how we can use Flow to connect to other systems as well. In Module 5, we're going to talk about the new Common Data Service. The Common Data Service allows us to build applications using what's referred to as the Common Data Model, which basically brings together the best of all the different applications from typical CRM, ERP, as well as Office productivity applications like meeting information into one data model that can be leveraged by applications you build with Power Apps and Flow. So we'll be talking not only about how it can be used in the context of building new applications, but of how it can be used for integrating data across all these different applications. In Module 6, we'll do a course review, look back at what we've covered in the different modules, as well as look forward to what you can do to continue your learning now that you've got the basics of how to build Power Apps and Microsoft Flow automation with Dynamics 365. So that's what we're going to cover. Let's get started with the first module. Welcome to Module 1. In this module, we're going to do an overview of PowerApps, Microsoft Flow, and the Common Data Service. As part of that, we'll look at how Dynamics 365 fits into the overall Microsoft Business Application Platform strategy. We'll look at identifying the key scenarios where you'll leverage PowerApps, Microsoft Flow with Dynamics 365. And finally, we'll spend some time learning the basics of the components that make up PowerApps and how you can build an application and how they deploy into an enterprise environment. So to get started, let's make sure that we're clear on what we're talking about when we say business application platform. Specifically, we're focused on internal line of business applications, productivity applications that make users more productive. For the applications we're talking about as part of this course, you can really drive that into 3 core pillars, 2 of which we'll be covering in detail in this course. These are guided by measure, act, and automate. Think about measure as being all about analytics and kind of measuring performance and how are we doing on things and using that to ultimately decide how to act. But act can also be more interactive. Act is what is done with PowerApps that we'll be talking about in this module. That's where a user is interactively using the application that's been built. And then automate is that background, something that happens either on a timely basis or in the background started by another process, but it runs without guidance, automating something that might be either too complex for a user to do on their own or too tedious, and we want to automate the process or connecting across multiple systems. I think it's important to highlight the audience that is intended for PowerApps and Microsoft Flow is the power users, as well as in the Dynamics 365 world. Oftentimes that can also include the customizers that would customize Dynamics 365. Now that doesn't mean there's not an extensible story with developers. We'll talk about that in a second. But the key thing to understand here is that the focus is on empowering the power users and the customizers to be able to build applications without requiring developer level skill sets or knowledge of the underlying developer technologies. Now, it's important to understand, though, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for developers also. There may be some things that you need to do in your Power App that require developer assistance, and that's where developers can build things in Azure App Services or Azure Functions that can be called from Power Apps and be able to extend Power Apps to integrate with those more complex operations, allowing that seamless transition from power user created application to developer created functionality. The same thing with Microsoft Flow. That Flow runs on top of the Azure Logic Apps infrastructure, but provides a more power user focused interface. But at the same time, that Microsoft Flow can grow up or can be re-implemented using the Azure Logic Apps to be able to do more complex things that aren't possible in the Flow interface. And probably my favorite part of working with Power Apps and Microsoft Flow is its ability to connect to data and services across the enterprise, as well as external services that you need to bring in and orchestrate processes across the different applications. And so that's where we have the connectors and the gateways that allow us to access these services. We also have the common data service that has a common data model allowing us to store either working data for integrations that we do across these applications, or to build applications on that's wholly contain the data inside that common data service. Our focus in this course, however, is on Power Apps, Microsoft Flow, the common data service, and the connectors and gateways that make all this possible to connect together. It's amazing how easy it is to get so focused on one little component that we forget the overall big picture story. So if we take 2 steps back, look at the overall Intelligent Business Cloud that Microsoft has and the components that make it up. We see on there the Power Apps, Microsoft Flow, Azure, all being the low-level infrastructure components that we then build on top of it, the other applications such as Dynamics 365. But yet these all work together, and through the connectors that we have available that are in use by Power Apps and Flow, we can connect to things like the Office 365 services. We can connect to the external services that are provided by third-party business applications. And using the common data service, we can store data that's relevant to all of these. So now let's take a look at a high level, the architecture of an application that leverages Power Apps Flow and the Common Data Service to build an application that extends Dynamics 365. Quickly, before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Power Apps, and I want you to compare that Power Apps to simply customizing a form in Dynamics 365, because that might be what you're used to. Think about when you build a form in Dynamics 365, you're putting data from Dynamics 365. It's typically only a single application. Sure, you can do some integrations with iframes and other extensibility techniques, but generally speaking, it's designed for displaying the data that's within the Dynamics 365 application. Power Apps, on the other hand, is simply a canvas that you can put data from multiple applications. Dynamics 365 being just one of those applications that you might bring the data into the Power Apps and display it on the surface. That's one of the things that's powerful about Power Apps is that you're able to have data from multiple systems appear in the visual space of the user, and each of them come from their own places, but from the user's perspective, it looks like it's all stitched together in one place for them to use. So let's dive a little deeper and look at what an application looks like that we build with PowerApps that leverages some of the Dynamics 365 data. First of all, we'll start with looking at the Dynamics 365 business applications. We've got sales, field service, customer service, project service automation that all make up the customer engagement applications and have a data repository that store the data for those business applications. We also have the operations that has the data repository that is unique to it as well. Now, when we start talking about connecting both of these, we'll see that there are connectors that are specifically guided for working with data from both of those business applications. To build an application, we start by creating a new PowerApps or a new Microsoft flow that we're going to start building out. Now, when we first create these applications or the flows, they don't have any knowledge of Dynamics 365. The way they gain that is by adding a connection using the Dynamics 365 connectors that are available. By adding the connector and identifying the instance that we want to connect to from Dynamics 365, we can then select the data entities that we want to expose the data to that Power App. That data is then available for use in the galleries, lists of records, or on individual forms, or for interaction for things like creating records within the Power App and then storing it back into Dynamics 365. Once we've established the connection, it's available for both Power Apps and flows to use that connection. When you're looking in the list of connectors, you'll also see that there's a Dynamics 365 Operations connector. So the one that is labeled Dynamics 365 connector is for the customer engagement application data repository, sales, field service, customer service, and project service automation. The Dynamics 365 Operations connector is specific to the operations data store. But it works in a similar way, exposing ability to trigger and also execute actions such as create queries against the data repository in the operations data store. So in our example here where I show a connection to both Dynamics 365 and Dynamics 365 Operations, in our application, either Power App or Flow, we could have data available from both those applications presented like they were a combined application without the user knowing that they came from two physical data repositories. Now, there is effort underway to automatically provide some synchronization between the data repositories of the different business applications for scenarios like profit to cash, but using the connectors, you can satisfy your more custom needs that aren't handled by the out-of-the-box scenarios. Now we add in the Common Data Service, a cloud-scale data service that PowerApps and Flow can connect to for accessing data. One of the things that makes the Common Data Service unique from just a normal database that you might think of is it comes with what's referred to as the Common Data Model. The Common Data Model is a set of entities. Every Common Data Service that you create has that same model, that same starting point, but you can create custom entities and attributes as needed for your own custom data models. But you're guaranteed that as you connect to a different Common Data Service, that it has the same starting point that you were working with in your other environment. That consistency allows you to build Power Apps or flows that work against that with having a known model. Now, the model was built by looking at the needs of the operations business application as well as the customer engagement business applications, as well as adding in some of the other Office things like activities that happen in the Office 365 environment, ultimately allowing some of those in the future to be automatically synchronized into the Common Data Service, allowing you to build a Power App that relies solely on the Common Data Service if needed. But you have the choice of using any of the connectors or the Common Data Service, and in some scenarios you may find that it is easier to create the data in the Common Data Service rather than have to go back to the customer engagement application data model and make a change there that might not be appropriate for all users. And that's what makes it appropriate for building a Power App that could be just used by 2 or 3 users, but makes those 2 or 3 users really productive. And finally, we can't forget that the Power Apps in Microsoft Flow can connect to third-party applications, Office 365 services, as well as custom data sources created through API apps or Azure functions that are created by developers can be brought into Power Apps or Flows as first-class interactions. Now, you probably are wondering how to choose the right application architecture. When should you use Power Apps? When should you use the built-in mobile app? Let's talk about that. First of all, let's start with the Dynamics 365 mobile application. So the nice thing about this is it leverages the existing configurations that you have on your web application. So in some ways, it's just an extension of the way the user can interact with the Dynamics 365 application. It doesn't do a lot to bring in other applications. You can bring in data from other applications, but that requires a developer resource to typically do those types of modifications. So it's best when the focus is within the Dynamics 365 application. Using security and other techniques, you can narrow down the application, let the application user see only certain things. Another benefit it has that is very powerful is that it has full offline support. So if you need to support scenarios where the user goes into a customer that may not have public network access to where they can get back to the Dynamics 365 server, the Dynamics 365 mobile app's offline capability can be extremely powerful, allowing when they connect back up those updates to be synchronized back to the server. Building a PowerApps is best when you want to leverage the no-code business application capabilities. So something a power user could build without having to go to a developer, without having to understand deep customizations. They can start as simple as adding a few fields on a form. They can always get some help when they get stuck. It's a good choice for task-focused internal applications. What do I mean by task-focused? For example, a sales coach might show a list of opportunities. You click on it. It might give you some tips for working with that particular opportunity. It might pull in data from other systems. So using the connectors, this is where it's really powerful with the Power App that I can pull in data from other systems, whether it be Dynamics 365 operations or SharePoint or other internal systems that I've built custom connections to. But in both of these scenarios, I'm really focused on the internal user base. The final category I'll talk about is native client apps. So these are the ones that developers build. They use all the native tools. These are great choices for building external applications where you have external users. They're not as good for internal applications because oftentimes you have to invest a lot of time and effort to be able to do them. They tend to be bigger applications that you want to invest in those. So when you think about an application that you'd build with PowerApps, you could think, I'm going to spend a couple hours today, a couple hours tomorrow, and have an application that works. Whereas with a native client app, you have to have a developer. They'll probably spend a few days at least, if not weeks, getting an application up and running, doing some basic things. But it is good if you want a very nicely polished application that you're going to put in an external app store and go to an external audience. That's when you would look to the native client apps. Power Apps would be good for that quick. We have a couple hours, we want to build an app for our upcoming conference, and we want to collect some things from the attendees and be able to augment data that's in Dynamics 365. That's an application we could build with a Power App in a relatively short time and have some good business value back from building that application. Now let's transition and talk a little bit about Power Apps specifically and talk about what it really means to build a Power App and what it takes to get that off the ground and make it available to other users in your organization. So we've already talked about what you're building is an actual internal application focused on internal audience. What you're building is either a web or a mobile application. So when you actually start a new Power App, you're actually going to make a choice in template, either between a phone style template or a tablet style template. The tablet style template can still be run on a phone device. It just, the orientation, the sizing of it is geared towards a larger footprint. You'll be using a visual designer to actually compose the pages, dragging and dropping and inserting pieces onto there, all visually done either through the web-hosted designer, or if you install PowerApps Studio, you have an application that is available for designing the application. In Module 2, we'll be diving into how you connect to the services, including Dynamics 365, to be able to access data, but that's your gateway to be able to interact with that data and services. The applications themselves, when you create it, is only available for you. It's like your own little application until you go through the action of either sharing it with specific users. For example, you might share it with a team member or all of your team members, or you might share it organization-wide and make it available to a broader audience. So publishing doesn't involve going to an application store. It simply means making it available to other users in their runtime player. So when they load up their PowerApps Studio, they'll see the list of applications that they have available to them. They can choose to run individual applications. Same thing when they log into the PowerApps web portal, they can see what applications are available to them. When they're using the applications, they can also pin specific applications from the player onto the start page on their device, making it easier to launch directly into that application. The life cycle of a Power App is very simple. You start with the visual design. So this is when you create your initial application. You get it to a point where you're ready for some feedback to have some other users kick the tires on it. You save and publish it. You then share it to make it available. When you share it, you can actually decide if you want to give editing rights to that application. So I could share it with you, allow you to co-design it with me. Now you have to be a little bit careful. Currently, there is really designed for only one person editing at a time. So if you do share with others, make sure you coordinate access to that application so you're not stepping on each other. Then people run the app. You get feedback from it, and you then go back and tweak the design. We went through this process for one of the applications we built recently for about a week till we got it to where people were happy with it. And that's when we released it to the wild. And then you start taking longer time to go through the cycle, and it matures as an application. But this is the general life cycle that you go through. The PowerApps Visual Designer is where you'll be spending your time actually building the application. It all starts by File New, creating a new application, picking your template. You can start with one of the templates that's available, or you can choose to start with blank, where you get literally just a blank screen in the template size that you chose, either phone or tablet. You would then typically connect to other data sources. You'd start putting fields on the forms. You'd start configuring those fields. You'd add other screens. You'd leverage some of the other capabilities like GPS or the camera. You might take a picture of an image. Those are controls that you have available to you to insert on the design canvas of the different pages. Let's talk about some of the core concepts that you need to understand when you're building an application. The first one is to understand screens. When you create a new application, you get one screen, or think about it as a page that is defined in your application. If you started with a template, you might have some initial data like the contacts list that I'm showing in my example here. That was because I used one with a contact template to start out with building it. If I had started with a blank template, I would have one screen that would have just blank on it. Now you can create multiple screens for different reasons. For example, as you can see here, the first screen, browse screen, has a list of records on it. The second one is a detail screen. I might have a separate screen that I define for uploading or capturing an image of that contact. Perhaps I was visiting them and I want to take a photo of them and update that contact's photo. The user of the application interacts with the screens and navigates from one screen to the next by causing some action to happen. For example, I might click on the icon next to Thomas's name, and that might cause it to navigate from the list screen to the detail screen. And on the detail screen, I might hit the back arrow that takes me back to the list of contacts. The next core concept you need to understand is expressions. This is how you make things happen. So if you remember how I talked about in the previous example, from moving from the list page to the detail page, when you clicked on that little icon next to Thomas's name, well, this is how it actually happens. So at the top middle of the studio, you're going to see an area for expressions. You're going to see a list of events. So in the case of the icon, when somebody clicks it, it's an on select event. So I've selected on select. And in the right-hand side of that equal sign, it says FX and then it says navigate. Now what that is the expression that I want to run when that event occurs. So in other words, when the user clicks the button, I want to navigate to another page. So in there, I've used an expression. The expression I've used is a function called navigate. I've specified the screen name that I want to navigate to. And the second parameter, none, is actually the transition that I want. Do I want it to fade? Do I want it to do something fancy? And when we're actually in the interactive designer, you'll see, and I'll demo this in a second, you'll see that we get hints of what to provide for the parameters to that function. If you're not familiar with building functions, you might be familiar with a similar concept. If you've ever built some formulas in Excel, it's the similar concept. You're just doing it to react to something the user does in the application. We'll see more of that as we dive in deeper, both in the initial demo and then in the second and third module when we go into deeper concepts of how to do some of the common tasks. The final core concept I want to cover before we jump in and see a demo of this is controls. Now, think about it. Nobody likes to see just simple text or a text input box for everything in an application. If you think about the applications that you really like, they're easy to use. Well, what makes an application easy to use? If the controls you interact with are a little easier to interact with. So things like a toggle, a slider, maybe you're doing ratings, collecting from people attending an event, what their feedback is on the event. Well, what if you could have a nice little star control? Well, certainly not all of us can build these controls, so we can just insert them from the control list and add them on and use them as part of our pages. Now we also have things like galleries. So galleries are actually lists of records. We'll be seeing a lot more about galleries and forms in the next module as we start connecting to some of the Dynamics 365 data. But galleries allow us to display a list. So the list of contacts there is a type of gallery that was used to display the list. Forms help us provide both viewing of detailed data. So on the left-hand side of my slide here, where you see the contact detail record, the second screen from the top on the left, that is actually using one of the display forms to be able to see the data in a kind of a simple structured format. That same form can be used in edit mode, allowing us to modify and create records really easily. So some of these are things that help us get started. Media has things like images. So if I want to put a picture of the contact on the form, use the entity image, for example, that's easy to do by grabbing from the media set of controls. I can also use some of the richer ones like camera to be able to capture a picture. Maybe I'm out doing assessment of competitors. Maybe I'm assessing damage that occurred and I'm visiting the customer to see what damage they had so I can create a report and file a claim for them. That can be done by using the camera control on there. And finally, the charts tab allows us to have some of the popular things like maybe I want to include some basic charts in my application to show progress of how we're doing with particular scenarios. That's easy by just inserting the chart control. We'll see more of controls as we dive a little bit deeper later in the modules. Now, I briefly have talked about connectors and connecting to data and services a few times as we've got into the details here, but I've never really shown you some of the other ones other than the Dynamics 365 ones. The nice thing here is you can get to all kinds of services, from sending emails to maybe you want to post to Facebook, Twitter, maybe you want to pull in data from a Dropbox or an Excel file or SharePoint, or you want to send an email through Office 365. Those are all things you can do with the connectors. And these are available to be used with both Power Apps as well as Flow. Once you establish the connection, it's a shared connection between both of those. And what actually happens when you actually share your application, so let's say I had a connection to Dynamics 365 and I share an application with my team, that connection is shared with them, but they authenticate using their own credentials. So they do need to have access to that service when they're connecting to Dynamics 365. So it's not intended to build an application and give to a user that didn't have a Dynamics 365 account already, because the connection does take on their context of interaction when it's connecting to that service. You can also use the same concept to connect to custom APIs. For example, we have a Power App that we built for our own internal company that tracks our billable time, and that actually connects to not only Dynamics 365, Office 365, merges the data together, provides the data back for the user to visualize, and then it stores it back in our time and billing entities for use with our billing tracking. But we did that through a custom API because we needed some additional capabilities for merging the data that we couldn't do only with the Dynamics 365 connector. So there's a lot of flexibility with the connectors to connect quickly to other services, but also build custom ones that might reach into your own internal systems that don't have public connectors available for use with them. We'll see how connectors work when we start connecting to data in Module 2, working with the connectors with the Power App. Well, now's a good time for us to jump into PowerApps Studio and actually build an application so you see how this works and how we get started with a Power App. Okay, I'm going to start out here in the Windows Store application. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go install the PowerApps application. So I'm going to search on PowerApps. I'm going to find the PowerApps Studio. Go ahead and get that. Okay, now that it's installed, I'm going to go ahead and launch the application. Now the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually sign in and connect to our organization account. So I'll go ahead and fill this in. It'll prompt me. This is the same credentials I would use to log in to Dynamics 365. Now, when you first get into the application, you'll notice that if we go to open, that we'll see several different ones that say click to download. These are all sample applications, a good place to kind of get started to see an idea of how PowerApps works and what types of things you can do with PowerApps in building your applications. I'm just going to go ahead and pull the customer success one. And what's going to happen when I click to download, it's going to load that into my local player, and then that's going to allow me to go ahead and launch the application. And you can see this is one that's kind of built up, allows me to look at a customer, allows me to see some details about them, see where they are on the map. I can go and see their active work orders. I can even come in here and give some feedback. Maybe I want to say that they've got, how often do they need technical support? And you're kind of seeing the types of applications that you can build with PowerApps. These are very rich, they're very purpose-built. So this is all about customer success and kind of working with your customers, identifying feedback. And great job. Go ahead and submit. And we can go back to our customers. So I wanted to start by showing you what it looks like to run an application in the PowerApps Studio. And then we'll look at kind of how to build an application from there. Now the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and exit out of this. So I'm going to right click and I'll use the exit to get back to the main application. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and click new, and we could build either from one of the templates that's quick start. So that what these are, if I chose for example Dynamics 365 up here, what this would give me is a basic application that has a gallery list that lists the records. You get to choose the type of record you want to show. So I could choose accounts, leads, opportunities, whatever I want to show. It's going to give a basic list of those records and then a detailed page that you can drill down into to see it, as well as a search box. Now it's not very smart right now in terms of which fields it picks to show in the list or on the detail form, so you will have to do some updating of it. Like if you chose leads, you'd want to choose the subject of the lead, the name of the company that the lead was about. You want to pretty it up a little bit, but it's not a bad starting place as well. All you want is for an entity, a list, a search box, and a detail page. You can also come down here and you can choose any of the blank applications. This is probably where I spend the most time creating applications, is either a blank phone layout or a tablet layout. Now you do choose an orientation right now of what you want, whether it's phone or tablet. Now we've built some tablet applications that work fine on the phone. It's just not as geared towards the phone. So I recommend that you pick what's closest to what most users will use your application. Some people will actually build one for both layouts if it's something that's very popular that warrants that extra work to have one for each of the layouts. You can also go into application templates. Application templates gives you some starting points for being able to build things out. So if we look at that, you'll see that you've got asset checkout, cost estimator. These are all like the sample applications, but these are ones that you can actually edit and tailor to your own particular needs. What I'm going to do is go ahead and choose a blank application with the phone layout. Let it go ahead and create that. You'll see that I've got one screen that's created for me. It's blank, waiting for me to add things. You'll notice it has a name of screen 1. What I like to do is give meaningful names to these. So I might give this, if this is my home page, my main screen, I might give it a name something like home. And you notice I did that by just coming up here and clicking in there and real simply just putting the name home in there. Now, what I also might want to do is I might want to have a little bit of some colors on here or things like that. I could use the themes. We'll talk about those upcoming modules. I can also come in here and do some basic things, like I may want to have add button on here. And it doesn't have to be an add button. You can use buttons that are traditional like this. You can also come into insert, go to icons. If you want to have it a little bit fancier, scroll down, we'll find the plus for the add. Put that over here in the corner so that we know. And what I want to do is be able to navigate this to another page or another screen. So what I can do here is I've got a couple options. I can come down here and I can say duplicate screen, or I can say new screen. And what new screen is going to do is go ahead and add another one. And what I can do on this screen now is come up here, give it, go to home, come back to screen, give it a name of add page. Now what I'm going to do to get to there, so let's say I wanted to have the user be able to create a new record. What I would do is click on this. Now this is where we start getting into the basics of events and function expressions that run on it. So over here I have the list of different events. So these are all the events and properties that I can change things with. So onSelect is an event that occurs. So that occurs when I click on the plus here. You can also do things with color where you're setting RGB colors. And these can all be dynamically changed. But what I want to do is go back to that onSelect, and you can get there either by scrolling down the list, or I can simply type that and then tab over. Now you notice that it says false here. That just means that there's nothing that's going to happen. When you're building these expressions, you can either key things in here, or you can also kind of get a cheat sheet by looking at the list of functions. So I could come down here and look for things that's working with text. So what I can do is come up here, I can simply just come in and start typing, and I know I want to navigate to another page, so I don't even have to remember the full function. What I can do is just type part of it, and you'll notice that I get the help. It tells me this is transitions to another screen, so what I can do is go ahead and add that in. It'll tell me what the parameters are, so you always want to look up here to kind of see what the hints are, because this really makes it so you don't have to remember all the details of each of the functions. So what it's asking me is, where do I want to navigate to? Well, I want to navigate to the add page. So I'm going to come down and select that and do a comma. You'll see that it now wants to know if there's a transition. So, if I want to do a fade or I want to do none, we'll go ahead and do fade. And then I could add additional parameters such as context. We'll talk about that later in one of the subsequent modules of when you would use that. But for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and say that's all I want to provide here, and I'm going to close it with a parentheses. And now that I've got that simple one on here, I'm able to actually see this work. Now, the nice thing is you can interactively do the building of an application. You don't have to build it all at once and then hope it works. I can take little baby steps. So like now that I've created that second page, maybe I want to run the application. So from here, I come up to the toolbox up here and I click the preview app. Could also hit F5 to do that. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And now I'm in the application, and now I've got my little plus here. And what I can do is go ahead and click that, and I'll go to my next page. Now this doesn't really show much on that second page because we haven't added much on there. So what we're going to do is go ahead and come to that second page, our add page. We're going to go ahead and pick a layout. So I'm going to go ahead and on here just give it a title, add record. And I'm going to come back up here to my icons, and we'll just, for right now, put the little X on there. We notice that that's not very clear what color it is. So why don't we change that? Make that white so it stands out a little bit. Or I happen to just know that the RGB code for white is 255, 255, 255. You can use some of the charts on the web, pick the nice color, and it will give you a list on there also. But now we've got that nice little click. And what we can do here is just like we did before, we come up to the onSelect for this. So I can just pick it from the list. And again, I'm going to navigate. And I actually could do this way, or I could do it just back. I'm going to go ahead and navigate back to home from here, just like we did before. Now the other way you could do this, in case the page is navigated to from multiple places, so maybe you come from page 1 to page 2 and page 3 to page 2, what you could do is to go back, like in a cancel situation, you can literally use the back function, and it takes the same transition. We'll just say none this time. And now what we can do is go ahead and run our application again. And now we've got that going back to our main page. So nothing too fancy, but we built our first application. We can see how this works. Now the other thing I can do, you want to make sure to save your application. So before you get too far into this, you'll want to save it. What you want to do is go set the name. So we'll call this our first application. And we'll come down here and pick a nice red icon and go ahead and then save. Now that saves it to the cloud. We can also save it to our local computer. When we save it to the cloud, the nice thing is that we can actually come back into either here and see it, or we could also switch gears. So I'm now in the browser, web.powerapps.com. If I go to apps in here, go ahead and filter apps I own. Go ahead and refresh. And there's our first app that we just created. And what I can do is I can actually open this up in the browser. And I'm now in a similar experience that I had in the PowerApps Studio Windows Store application. And what I can do is go ahead and run this, move between it, same exact experience, the design time. If I come up here, this is all very similar. It's just I'm in a web browser that lets me work with it. Now, if I go back to my list of applications, come over to the right-hand side here, you'll see that I can play it. So when I play it, I'm not in edit mode. You're not previewing it. I can look at settings. If you are ready to share this, so for example, I want to share this with my other team members or the organization because it's now ready to be published. This is where I'd come and I'd actually pick who I want to share it with. Might share it with a couple of team members to start out. But that's a first look at building a very simple application. Now that you've actually seen PowerApps Studio and seen building a basic application, you probably have your own ideas, probably too many ideas for what the time you have to actually build applications. But in case you don't, I wanted to give you a few application scenarios that might be appropriate for PowerApps so to get you started with your thinking on your own internals. Let's start with a new sales staff onboarding app. So typically think about your salesperson that comes on board. There's several things you have to get them entered into the different systems. You got to set up with the commission application. You got to get them set up in the various other internal places. You need to go through a checklist type application. So you could build that in PowerApps. Not only could you build that in PowerApps, you could also use PowerApps to automate some of the things we might kick off in actual Flow. So when we talk about PowerApps and Flow later, you'll see that some of the scenarios actually start in PowerApps, but actually finish in Microsoft Flow when the workflows run to complete the activities that have been started from the user interaction. Now, obviously, this isn't just limited to sales. I use that as an example. Service staff or any other staff that you have to onboard, you could build similar type applications. In fact, you could also use it even once the employees are on board, more of a coaching type application. And you could pull in some of the real data. So when you're giving them coaching tips, you could do it in the context of some of the data. And that might make sense because your team might have a particular way of building and going through the processes that is different from other teams. So your team might get together and build their own sales coaching application with some of the best practices they've found, combine it with the data, and that's what your users can jump into as they're learning how to be more effective at their sales. Another scenario that can be useful is special event data collection. So, oftentimes we've seen customers that have had user groups that they sponsor for their customers that use their products. They could be focus groups where they get a bunch of people together to give feedback on a product they're about ready to launch. But the general idea is you have some set of people that you invite. Possibly that data came from Dynamics 365, maybe even had a marketing list that had the original list, and you had just the people that RSVP'd. From there, you may meet with them at the individual event, say, hey, what's your name? My name's Dave. I look it up in the app. So in the app, it interfaces to pull the data from Dynamics 365. I might collect some data. Now, that data could be stored back in Dynamics 365, so what their feedback is on the new product. Or I might decide, as we see later in the modules, we talk about the common data service, I might define a custom entity that I'm going to store the data that I collect for this particular application because it's not data that's appropriate for pushing back into Dynamics 365. But this type of application could be used for a number of scenarios for that custom data collection. That data collected could then be later analyzed in Power BI or could be used to have other actions taken, like to send follow-ups or other automation that you might push data back into Dynamics 365. So the next scenario we'll talk about is an on-site customer visit app that combines sales and operation data. It could combine other data as well from internal system through a custom API and bring that into a Power App on a single surface so you can see it all in one place. Now, an application like this could start by pulling up the customer name directly, or it could even start earlier in the process. So in other words, planning my visits. Maybe I visit cities, and while I'm in the city, that salesperson visits 5 or 6 customers. So this may start by planning the trip, picking the customers you're going to visit, having them set for schedules, have some automation to even allow creating the scheduled appointments, allow you to find the location quickly, and you could do this all from the mobile application that you built using PowerApps. Now, when they're visiting the customer, they pull up that customer, they could do a quick report on the customer. That again, that data could go back into Dynamics 365 or could be stored in the common data service if it was more appropriate to be separate. You have a lot of options for deciding where it's most appropriate to put the data based on how you're going to leverage it going forward long term. Is it data that needs to be in Dynamics 365, or is it just your own personal data that you built as a productivity application? And the final scenario I couldn't help but throw in there is one that we did because we had our time and billing already stored in Dynamics 365, gathering coded time entries from the Exchange calendar and putting it in as billable entries into Dynamics 365, combining it with the clients that are billable items that are in there. You can all kinds of mashups like this, and that's one of the things that PowerApps is really good at, is combining data from all these different places. And the key thing here is making it easier for the people that need to use the application to do that. So rather than requiring somebody to go to the calendar, look up events, bring that over into Dynamics 365, we've brought that together for them and presented it to where they could just approve the list and submit their time. And that's what PowerApps does, makes things easier. So as you're thinking about the scenarios, you'll notice a theme that I've presented here. None of these are huge, big apps. None of these are replacements for Dynamics 365's mobile application that can do everything. These are all very purpose-built applications. The user will go in and out of that application to perform a task. That makes it both easy to build, and it also makes it easier to maintain and enhance as you get feedback on the use. So when you're thinking about the scenarios, avoid the big bang, big huge applications, and think about small things that make a very measurable difference in the productivity of who you're building the application for. Now that you're starting to get an idea of what PowerApps are all about, let's take a break, talk about Microsoft Flow, and then later in Module 2, we'll come back to PowerApps and dive even deeper to help you understand how to build more applications that connect with Dynamics 365. If you're familiar with Dynamics 365 workflows, you should be very comfortable with building Microsoft Flows as well. At a high level, the concepts are very similar. You have a set of actions you want to take. You might have some conditions in there. And what you're trying to do is orchestrate making that happen, and it might run over a period of time. Using that description, they sound very similar. Let's leave it at that for the comparison now, but I'll come back in a couple slides and explain to you in a more detail when you would use one versus the other. But I want to make you comfortable that if you know how to build a Dynamics 365 workflow, building a Microsoft Flow is similar concepts. So for example, just as you'd trigger a Dynamics 365 workflow on a create of a record, you could trigger a Microsoft Flow on a create of a Dynamics 365 record. You could also trigger it, and I've done this, based on an inbound email that came into a particular folder, or a file that got put into Dropbox, or a tweet that you picked up on Twitter. Those could be all things that start the automation to start running. Now, once the flow has been triggered, it executes a series of actions or steps as it goes through the automation. You can guide the path that the automation takes by putting in branching conditions. Or, for example, let's say that you use the connector to retrieve a set of records, maybe all the contacts associated with an account. Use a loop to loop through each of those contacts and perform some action on each of the contacts that was associated with the account. Oftentimes, the flows that you build can span multiple systems. In fact, they may be triggered by one system, and then the action occurs in another system. So you're bridging the gap between the two systems. Now, oftentimes, these can be done for your own personal productivity. We'll also see later on that you can build flows that are managed by a team or available to the team to use and see their actions as well. Flows like PowerApps are built in a visual designer using a web-based designer where you essentially establish the actions that compose the overall flow and the path that it'll take, adding in the condition checks and connecting to the data using the connectors. Now, Microsoft Flow doesn't require any developer skills to be able to build a Microsoft Flow that you're going to use, but it is built on Microsoft Azure Logic Apps. Now, Logic Apps is the professional developer experience for building similar type things. Gives you a little bit more low-level power than you have with Microsoft Flow, but ultimately you'll see it when we talk about the roadmap that you'll be able to take a flow and turn it into a Logic app later on. For example, if you wanted to have more enterprise deployment capabilities that you get with the Logic apps. Now, another thing that we'll talk about in the later module when we talk about flow in detail is the ability to trigger it on demand from a Power App. So the way to think about this is you could have a button next to a contact on your list of contacts that says Start Flow. And when you click that button, what it actually does is transfer some data from the Power App, parameters that you define, so the data you want to send, and it transfers that data to the Microsoft Flow that you build, and then that flow picks up running the rest of the steps. And using this pattern gives you the ability to start something, kind of request the action happen, and then the flow run in the background without requiring the user to keep the application running or wait for those actions to complete. So that's an additional way of triggering a flow beyond the triggered events like an email received or a record created that I've already talked about. Now let's come back before I demonstrate how to build a Microsoft Flow and talk a little bit about the comparison between a Dynamics 365 workflow and Microsoft Flow. First, let's start by looking at a very classic example of a Dynamics 365 workflow. So in this example, I trigger based on a case being created. It creates a follow-up task for somebody to follow up. That updates the account to indicate that there's an outstanding task. We wait for the case to resolve, so we use a wait condition in the workflow. When the case has been resolved, we use voice of the customer to send out a survey. And then if the case isn't resolved in a reasonable amount of time, we escalate it to a manager so that they can assign somebody else to follow up on the case. Now, the key thing to notice here is all of this takes place within the confines of Dynamics 365, where other than sending out the survey, which might use email ultimately, we're really not interacting with other systems. Now on the bottom of the screen, you've seen where I've sketched out a flow that you might build that has a bigger process that spans different systems. For example, this starts when an AIR file is dropped into a Dropbox folder. That is the trigger that starts the flow to run. Based on that, we use the Dynamics 365 connector to create a case. Now it turns out that that created the case triggers the workflow that I showed you on the top of the screen. It runs through its normal processes. We then could have a delay waiting for the case to be resolved in Dynamics 365 through the service organization, and then we pick back up. If it was a billable incident, maybe it turned out it wasn't our problem, it was the customer's fault. So then we invoice the customer by going out to Dynamics 365 operations and creating the invoice to bill the customer for the service that we just provide. If it wasn't resolved, or if we need to notify somebody because of errors, we might use Twilio to go out and send a text. If we were processing the file to fix the errors, we might turn around and return that process file back into the Dropbox folder so they could pick it up. And we might use the email connector to send an email to the customer to let them know that it's been placed out on Dropbox. So the key difference here from the top to the bottom, and you'd notice we've even used the top workflow in the course of the overall process that we've built, but we've automated across a number of different systems and services using Microsoft Flow. Let's talk about some of the scenarios where you might use Flow to solve some problems. First one's a productivity focused one. How many times have you been looking for that document that one of your contacts had sent you on a deal and you just couldn't find it? So what you might end up doing is you might end up using a flow that detects an email that came in with an attachment. Because there's an attachment, it takes the email address, looks up to see if you have that contact in Dynamics 365, locate the account that contact is associated with, both using the Dynamics 365 connector and then using the SharePoint connector to create that document in the SharePoint document library. Choosing the library to upload it to based on the account code associated with that account. Now let's take another one that's more IT focused. This might actually start with some internal monitoring that triggers an alert, notifies the on-call using the PagerDuty connector that's available to go out and page the on-call person. But it might come back to Dynamics 365 ultimately to create a case for customer service to follow up with that customer in the morning to make sure everything's okay. From a sales perspective, you might automate some of the normal follow-up you do on a new lead that's assigned to you by sending some sales literature from SharePoint. A salesperson might be creative and look for mentions on Twitter or other social networks of your company name or even competitors and create leads and assign them to yourself in Dynamics 365. Now, it's probably important to point out here that there also is the availability of Microsoft Social Engagement that comes with Dynamics 365 business applications. It also has the ability to collect things like this and create records within Dynamics 365. However, there are times, though, what you'll notice with Flow as well as PowerApps, part of what you're doing is not necessarily the solution for the overall company, but more of a personal productivity solution for the individual salesperson or power user or set of users that have some smart idea that they could build in a short amount of time. Perhaps you've built a Power App that the operations team uses, and they have a legacy system that when certain things happen in the Power App, you need to get that data or information to the on-premise legacy application. You might want to offload that operation. So in other words, the user in the Power App clicks a button, it starts a flow. That flow runs and uses a connection out to post back to that on-premise application. But it does that in the background, so the operations user doesn't have to wait for that to happen. Take a simple HR scenario where they've created a SharePoint list that people can fill out their time off requests. Well, that could trigger a flow. In the flow, you can actually use the Office 365 interactions that allow sending an email that has approve or disapprove. If it's approved, you might also end up, if it's a field service personnel, somebody that goes out on field service requests, you might go back to the field service resource records within Dynamics 365 and mark that person as not being bookable during that particular time so they don't get assigned to calls during their approved vacation. So these are just scenarios, but you'll notice the common theme across all of them is they're all things that run in the background. So flow is kind of fire and forget, automate a series of steps across different systems and different services, and bringing that together where you can invoke it either based on a triggered event, things like a record created, or based on a click of a button in the Power App that starts the Microsoft Flow execution, and then it runs in the background. The next key component I want to talk about is the Common Data Service. The Common Data Service is a scalable cloud data store. That means that you don't have to administer a server. There's not something that you have to manage connectivity to. It's just a store that's available in the cloud, very similar to how you would use a SQL database, or even if you were to take an Excel spreadsheet or an Access database, but put it in the cloud and make it available with some security models around it. That's what a scalable cloud database looks like. You could compare it to how Dynamics 365 stores data because it has similar concepts. So just as in Dynamics 365, we store data in entities with fields or attributes associated with it. The same thing is true in the Common Data Model. Dynamics 365 has a set of out-of-the-box entities, account, contact. Well, the Common Data Model has similar ones as well. But where the Common Data Model is different is it starts with a standard set of entities that was created by looking across not only Dynamics 365, Dynamics 365 Operations Data Store, some of the Office 365 data stores, bringing them all together in a combined schema that represents the Common Data Model. A little later on in this presentation, I'll talk about the concept of deployments or environments. And when you create an environment, each environment can have one common data service that's running in it that you access the data. Now you can have multiple environments in an enterprise. You could have a dev, test, and a production, or for other departments, things like that, or even for individual teams. But the key is that each Common Data Service starts with the same Common Data Model. Now, you can extend the model by creating custom entities and attributes. So even the built-in entities you can add attributes to. Very similar concept that we're familiar to with Dynamics 365. Just like we've talked about connectors being available for Dynamics 365, there's connectors that work with the Common Data Service. So you can trigger a flow based on a new record in the Common Data Service. You can use the connector to create a record in the Common Data Service or update a record there. In fact, you could do your own synchronization between Dynamics 365 and operations or other systems using Common Data Service as kind of the intermediary landing spot for it. There will also be built-in synchronization with Dynamics 365 and Office 365 in the near future. That's being built by Microsoft as we talk. At the heart of the Common Data Service is the actual operational data store. This is meant to hold the real-time data. Now, the data can get in there from a number of ways. For starters, you can build a Power App or a flow that puts data into the Common Data Store. Additionally, in the near future, there'll be real-time sync services that will bring data in from cloud services and other on-premise data sources. And finally, there will also be pro developer tools, an API, that developers can use to interact with the data that's in the Common Data Service. Having a common data service has some benefits. For example, you can imagine how hard it would be to re-platform the data storage of Dynamics 365's business applications to combine them with other applications and agree on a data model. Whereas with the common data model, you can start with a fresh model, bring data into it from the different systems. In fact, you can even bring in on-premise data once the real-time sync type activities is in place. This may change how we think about building applications over time. If you think about today, where we might use the connectors to go back to Dynamics 365 and Office 365 individually, in the future, if some of that data is synchronized together into the operational data store where you could access just the common data service to be able to bring data into your Power App or to your flow, you might not have the need to navigate the complex location of the data simply by using the common data service to access the data all in one place. Now, this is going to change and evolve over the near future, so keep paying attention to how the Common Data Service has evolved the features, especially around the real-time sync and the Pro Developer API, because both will add added benefits to how we work and interact with the data in the Common Data Service. Now let's talk about some scenarios where leveraging the Common Data Service in conjunction with Dynamics 365 might make sense. Now, of course, if you were building a Power App fresh without using Dynamics 365 at all, you could always use the Common Data Service as your primary repository of data. That would make sense if you didn't already have Dynamics 365 there and using some of the entities in there. Now, if you're using Dynamics 365, a lot of the scenarios are going to be things that augment the data that is already in Dynamics 365, and you're making the decision to store it in the Common Data Service because it's not something that goes along with the data that's already in Dynamics 365. In a lot of scenarios, you're going to want to do the analysis to determine where's best to store it, and in many cases where it's data that's useful to everybody that uses, for example, the account, might make more sense to put it in Dynamics 365. But I'll use an example here: store customer profile information collected from Dynamics 365 customers. Well, you might say, well, we already have the accounts in there. Yes, but what if you had a team that wanted to build their own Power App that found that if they collect certain information from their customers, they're able to sell better? But it's not the same strategy that other teams use that also use the same customer account inside of Dynamics 365. Well, if you were to put that in Dynamics 365, it wouldn't be applicable to the others. And by not doing it, you'd be inhibiting the productivity of that team that could use the data. So they build their Power App, they create an entity in the Common Data Service, they match the key to the record of the account in Dynamics 365, and they store their profile information there and they use it in their Power App. Another show is trade show event data collection, where people are standing in the booth, they're talking to people, they collect all sorts of valuable information. A lot of times that data is lost and not attached to a customer who told them it. And wouldn't it be great if you had somewhere to put it? But now also, if you think about some of this data, it has a very short shelf life. So if you were to put it in Dynamics 365, you would be constantly purging it, and questions that you ask at one show might be different than another. So it wouldn't make sense to create permanent entities. Again, another scenario where you might consider creating an entity in the Common Data Service and storing that data in there. Another scenario, sometimes when you're building a Power App or even a Microsoft Flow, you need some state information, something to track where you currently are at, what the status is of something. But these are not fields that are relevant to other people because you've built your own flow or your own Power App for your own productivity. So these are examples where I might store that information in the Common Data Service and keep that separate from my Dynamics 365 data because it's not applicable to all users of Dynamics 365. And the final scenario I'll share with you as an idea, but not the final one that is available, because there's certainly a lot of ideas of ways that you can use the Common Data Service in conjunction with Dynamics 365. But this one is around storage of the coaching ideas. Remember, I talked about that as one of the ideas for building an application with Power Apps in Dynamics 365, building kind of a coaching application. You might even pull in the opportunities from Dynamics 365 with the connector, but for the list of tips, you might not want to store those in Dynamics 365. You might store those in a Common Data Service entity that has the tips that you pull in and show alongside of the opportunities. So the salesperson has the tips, and you could filter that based on the particular opportunity and the type of opportunity that is set up and give the appropriate tips that was tailored based on what was being asked for by the customer. So anyway, those are just some ideas of how you can leverage the Common Data Service. I really think there are two key scenarios. One, where the Common Data Service is the primary data store. The other is where you're leveraging it for storing information associated. And actually, there's probably a third, and that's when we start bringing in some of the synchronization of data from other systems, making the Common Data Service where you go to for your primary application data needs when you're building a Power App or Flow. That's where things will evolve as we start having some of the real-time synchronization. Now that we've talked about how you can build Power Apps, flows, as well as leverage the Common Data Service, I've kind of hinted at some deployment capabilities and how that would work, but let's talk a little bit more in detail about this. Now, to keep in mind, this is not an administrative course on how to manage enterprise deployments for Flow, Power Apps, and the Common Data Service, but I do want to give you some high-level understanding of how you would go about deploying into the different environments. The key thing to understand about environments is every time you build an application, a flow, a common data model, those exist in an environment. And along with the environment, so you could have different environments, like in this example, we've got Contoso USA, Contoso Canada, Contoso Australia. That's kind of separating by region, how they administer things. That would mean that each of those separate USA versus Canada, the CDM would be different. It is not sharing resources across the different environments. You'll notice that they have dev, test, and prod. So that's an example of giving some isolation across the life cycle of an application if you chose a more formal life cycle environment. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is each of the environments, the administrator of that environment can set restrictions on what users are able to do. For example, if you wanted to restrict the ability of users to use certain services, for example, you didn't want them to use the Twitter connector or certain other ones in there, you could configure only certain ones to be available. So in other words, if your administrator doesn't configure Dynamics 365 to be one in an environment you can use, you wouldn't be able to use that connection in there. So keep that in mind. That's part of allowing them to have complete control over the data and services that are used in each of the environments. Now, over time, as this evolves, the tools for moving packages between environments and data and so forth will be enhanced as well along with that, making this an easy lifecycle management environment to kind of work within your applications. Inside the PowerApps Studio, you can choose the environment that you're working with at a time. And when you choose that environment, that defines the applications, the flows, and the common data service that you're going to see within that particular environment. So that's why deployment environments are very important. And oftentimes, a new organization starting out with PowerApps and Flow should take a few minutes to kind of decide how they want to organize things as they're rolling that out and letting users empower themselves to build applications in their environments. Before we close out this module, I wanted to take a second to talk about some of the public roadmap that has been disclosed, because PowerApps and Flow and the Common Data Service are moving fairly rapidly and evolving based on user feedback that they take from everybody that's using it as the evolution happens. And you might keep in mind that some of the things that I mentioned on the roadmap then on the next slide may be things by the time you view this video may have already been released because things are happening quite rapidly as they roll out the new features. While I'm not going to cover all the planned enhancements, I do want to highlight a couple of them on here that are probably more important than others. The first is the solution packaging. This gives the ability to move a PowerApps from one environment to another, including a lot of the connections that are there. Whereas today you can move some of the pieces, but there's a little bit more manual intervention to move things between environments. The data sync with the Common Data Service. I talked about that real-time data sync, starting with some of the ability to have some certain scenarios filled out. That enables us to start relying on the Common Data Service as kind of a centralized location of data. ProDev control extensibility, that would allow us to have the ability to bring in custom controls into the PowerApps Studio environment. And the other one is from Flow to Azure Logic Apps. I think there's a lot of scenarios where things will start out with as Microsoft Flow, But as they get more enterprise oriented, or where they need to run on a regular basis, be deployed in a more controlled environment, those may be best to grow up into an Azure Logic app where they go through a formal enterprise lifecycle development, more like we would do oftentimes with Dynamics 365 customizations. But several times I can see needs where it actually starts out being prototyped in Flow and we'll move to those. So those are just some of the planned enhancements. Like I said, these are subject to change and they are happening fairly rapidly. So stay tuned and watch the PowerApps blog as well as the Flow blog for the ongoing announcements of the features that they release and some of the upcoming changes. So that's it. That wraps up our first module and kind of the overview of all the different major components. And the rest of this course will be diving deeper into each of them so you can learn how to do more specific things and build them out working with Dynamics 365. But at the end of the day, PowerApps Flow and the Common Data Service give you some tools to really rapidly build custom applications without having to get in and have professional developer experience and understanding how the developer tools work. You're using the visual designers, you're able to lay things out, you're able to build applications that people would believe were built by professional developer tools. They can handle scenarios that cross systems. So a lot of times these applications can be even personal productivity applications, things that individual users find would make them more productive. They may seek help from more complex things, so they may have a developer build certain functionality, but that developer functionality can be used from within the PowerApps foundation to be able to build the overall combined application. And probably most importantly, as the platform evolves, each release will bring new features to PowerApps Flow as well as the Common Data Service. So stick with us and let's go through and dive deeper in the subsequent module of this course and help you learn how to build more complex PowerApps flows and use the Common Data Service.